Hi, everybody. Another fantastic guest today. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. I have Louise Perry. How you doing, Louise?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Wonderful. Let me just read your brief bio. You're a journalist. You're a columnist for Unheard. You're a features writer for the Daily Mail, host of the Maiden Mother Matriarch podcast, director and co-founder of the Other Half think tank, and the author, first-time book author of this little gem called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century. Did I hit all the marks, or is there anything else you'd like to add to the bio?
No, very comprehensive, thank you.
All right, so why don't we start? I mean, this is a topic that's dear to my heart for several reasons, one of which is I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I've dealt with a lot of the feminists, both who love my work and the feminists who think I'm a Jewish quack Nazi scientist. So I've had both those. I also dealt with feminism in The Parasitic Mind, my last book, where I talk about militant feminism being an idea pathogen. So this is all within my wheelhouse. Why don't you just tell us the main premise of the book, and we could take it from there?
So my central claim is that men and women are different in certain very important ways. The obvious, well, I should say, I mean, the physical differences should be obvious. They're not obvious in 2023, but I think most people listening will recognize that the physical differences between men and women are very important. Only women can get pregnant. Only men can do the impregnating. Women are substantially smaller and physically weaker than men, etc., which has obvious social ramifications, particularly when it comes to heterosexual relationships. I also assert that there are some average psychological differences between men and women, that evolution didn't stop at the neck, and that those differences also play out in certain very important ways. And I think that feminists, and I count myself among them, have made an error in rejecting evolutionary psychology, because actually I think that it's a completely morally neutral tool. You know, it's a scientific discipline. It's not inherently political in any way. I think that actually there are lots of ways in which we can use evolutionary psychology in a really productive way to try and defend women's interests. Because my argument is that actually post-sexual revolution, we've entered a sexual culture which prioritizes short-term mating, particularly at certain points in your life cycle, and delayed marriage and delayed childbearing and all this and all these sort of modern features, which actually I think primarily serve the interests of a minority of men and cause women and the rest of men a lot of harm. So I
Right.
think that actually if we just accept that there are profound differences between men and women, we could have a much more sensible kind of feminist politics.
Right. So two things I want to say. First, my first exposure to evolutionary psychology was as my first semester as a doctoral student. I had taken a course by a professor named Dennis Regan, and about halfway through the course, he assigned the book Homicide by two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, Margot Wilson and Martin Daly. And in the book, they explore a wide range of forms of criminality via an evolutionary lens, and that's when I was hooked to the explanatory power of evolutionary psychology. Now, to your point about understanding the dynamics between men and women, one of the examples from their book that had really resonated with me was the universal and time invariant patterns of who is the most dangerous person in a woman's life, whether you're in the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon or whether you're in the 1950s in Detroit or today in London, is usually her long-term partner. It's not the serial rapist hiding in the trees. And usually the reason why you either have domestic violence leading all the way up to killing of a woman is for suspected or realized infidelity. And then, of course, you get into paternity uncertainty, the threats, and so on. And so, to your point, it is so outlandish to try to understand a sexually reproducing species that has sexual dimorphism, void of why these evolutionary principles exist. Why do you think the reticence exists among so many feminists?
I mean, the word that's been used most frequently by my feminist critics about this book is that I'm defeatist.
Right.
So the idea is that if you could only erase the differences between men and women, if we accept the idea that the differences between men and women are a consequence of socialization, then you can also believe that you could undo them, that it, you know, one generation's time, you could just completely transform how we raise little children. And then all of the sort of horrors of male violence against women, you know, the whole works would disappear.
Right.
The idea that these things are rooted in deep evolutionary history is really unwelcome if that's your project. I think that I just think that that project is a non-starter. I don't think it's ever going to succeed. I think that the task that's actually before us, if we're sort of practically minded, is to say, okay, here's how human beings are. What kind of incentives could we put in place? What kind of social institutions, laws, various structures that we can manipulate could we put in place that would encourage the best behavior in both men and women? I think that's actually the task, and you can't make any kind of attempt at that task unless you actually understand what human beings are like.
Right. And I don't, it's not just an academic exercise to, to tease out whether the social constructivists are correct or whether the evolutionists are correct. And of course, as you know, it's not that evolutionists reject the idea that socialization matters, but they recognize that socialization exists in its forms because of biological imperatives. But in any case, I think to the central premise of your book, and it's something that I cover briefly I have a forthcoming book on happiness, where I talk about, they are downstream effects of adopting ideologies that are antithetical to human nature. So if you tell women, look, you are indistinguishable from men, and if men are desirous of having, unfettered, sexual, sex behind the shed, burn your bras, ladies, and do the same. Well, okay, for some women, sure, they're interested in sexual variety and they're willing to have these short-term dalliances. But in terms of trying to establish a direct path to happiness, many women then end up, as the research shows, longitudinal tracking of happiness in women seems to perfectly coincide with going down with the adopting of many of these second wave feminist mantras. Do you get into that in your book?
No, but I am familiar with that research, and I think it is also remains true. I mean, it's very difficult to measure differences in happiness between parents and non-parents, as I'm sure you know from writing this book. But my understanding is that women who have children and get married and don't have very many sexual partners do tend to be, on average, slightly happier than other women. And yes, we definitely see this change over time, where actually since the second wave, women have become less happy on average.
Right. And of course, I mean, you would know this, but maybe some of our listeners don't. Equity feminists, a la, as espoused by, say, Christina Hoff Summers, is okay. Men and women should be treated equally under the law. There shouldn't be any institutional barriers against one sex. And I think most reasonable people would say, yeah, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. I think we're militant feminists, you can call them radical feminists, there are different appellations you can use, is where they say, well, I think you use the word their project. In seeking to implement the project of eradicating the patriarchal status quo, we need to murder and rape truth in the service of that noble goal. And how do you murder truth? You say that there are no evolved sex differences between men and women, because to internalize that correct position would then make it more difficult to eradicate the sexist. So in a sense, they do start off from a noble position, but then it sort of deviates into lunacy for consequentialist reasons.
Yeah, it's utopianism, and utopianism often comes it can come from a combination of emotional places, one of which is a very good one, to wanting to ameliorate suffering. One is, I think, actually quite often power hunger. The idea of recreating society according to your own blueprint is obviously very attractive for people who want to exert their will. The problem is that utopianism has an extraordinarily bad record historically in terms of actually improving anything, and can often be very dangerous. So I have a lot of friends who are radical feminists. I have historically been more sympathetic to radical feminism, and I do think that much of it is coming from a very good place in terms of just wanting to prevent rape and murder. That's a good thing. Almost all of us, I think, are in complete agreement on that project. It's just, how do you do it? And I don't think that focusing exclusively on socialization is how you do that.
Now, I noticed, I must admit that I only quickly kind of went through the main highlights of the book, so I haven't delved into it yet, although I hope to. I was looking at some of your blurbers or endorsers, and the first name I saw, which got me concerned a bit, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Julie Bindel, is it Julia or Julie? I can't remember. Is it
Julie, yeah.
Julie? Now, I think I'm going on memory here, but maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had released a Sad Truth clip in reference to a position she had taken where she was arguing that, heterosexuality is a bad thing. And so as many other women, feminists have done, Andrea Dworkin and so on. So how do you reconcile some of the stuff that she has said that I've been exposed to that seems kind of quacky with the fact she seems to certainly support your position? Are these two things reconcilable?
Well, Julie also wrote quite a critical review. So I go way back with Julie. We've known each other for like a decade
Okay.
because we have a shared interest in anti-sexual violence work, and so have worked together on several different things. We also disagree on a whole bunch. I think she's wrong about the idea that sexual orientation is entirely socialized. She thinks I'm wrong about marriage, among much else. But one of the things I really like about Julie, and the reason that we've been friends for so long, is that she doesn't sort of demand intellectual or political purity among her friends and associates. So we're able to disagree and agree
What a
without
novel
coming to
idea.
blows. Right. It's a rare and precious trait.
Right. Very nice. Were you always, I mean, if we were to, go back to, I don't know, your university days or whatever, did you always hold the positions that are ultimately espoused in your book, or was there a trajectory whereby you started, high heels are the patriarchy, and then moved into your current positions, and your position softened, or were you always holding that position?
I still hate high heels, but that's mostly because I have bunions, so I can't wear them. Yeah, no, I've definitely sort of been on a journey ideologically, although I was never really, I mean, so in the book I write often about liberal feminism. So feminism is an extremely factional movement. There's always been a lot of infighting. There's an interesting question there, actually, we might get to, about whether or not that's due to female intersexual competition. And I've never been convinced by liberal feminism, which is the dominant feminism right now is the sort of feminism of Cosmopolitan magazine and Emma Watson and Me Too, and very much of one accepts the idea that men and women are psychologically identical on average, and the physical differences between men and women are trivial, and moreover that anyone who wants to identify as the opposite sex or some other sex entirely is completely entitled to do so. I've never been convinced of that school of feminism. I have been, when I was at university, I volunteered in a rape crisis centre, and I later worked in a rape crisis centre, and was more convinced at that time by radical feminism, which is more like Marx, probably can best be understood as a kind of feminist iteration of Marxism, in the sense that it understands men and women as being distinct classes, and men have historically sort of exploited women's labor and so on. I don't hold to that view anymore. I think actually that history and contemporary reality is much more complicated than that, and I think that there is, as women and men have always and will, I hope, continue to collaborate in all sorts of important ways that aren't captured by that kind of conflict theory.
Right. Well,
Sexual politics.
I wanted to show you. Are you familiar? Do you know? Have you ever seen this book before? Do you know it? I don't
I
know if you
can't
could read
see.
it.
I can't
You,
see the
you can't
author.
see it.
Oh,
Okay, let me
David
read.
Buss. I've read lots of Buss. I don't know if I've read that one.
So this is an edited book by David Buss and Neil Malamute of UCLA. I'm not sure if he's retired now, and it's an edited anthology of article chapters where people are trying to reconcile some tenets of feminism with evolutionary psychology. And I think that if you if you practice or preach the quote correct version of feminism, you can actually see that they could be reconciled quite nicely. And so let me just offer one example that might be interesting to you, and certainly hopefully to our viewers and listeners. Sexual selection, which is a fundamental evolutionary mechanism, right? Natural selection are the adaptations that confer a survival advantage to an organism. Sexual selection are the ones that confer a mating advantage, right? So of course, most people know the classic example of the peacock's tail evolving. It evolves because of recurring female mate choice. So for most species, it is female mate choice that drives the evolutionary trajectory of male behavior, male morphology, male anatomy, right? And so even, for example, not men, but male testicles, you might know these studies done across primates. The size of male testicles in a species of primates is an adaptation to female promiscuity in that species. The greater the testicles, that usually implies that the females of that species engage in more promiscuous behavior, say like chimpanzees, whereas mountain gorillas, although they are formidable, the males are these majestic, massive beasts, their testicles are very small because their mating arrangement is one of polygyny. One male controls sexual access to many females. So only that could be viewed as quite an empowering feminist message, because you're basically saying that male trajectories are completely at the whim of what female choose. What could be more feminist than that?
Yes.
I mean, I'm rooting it in science.
Yeah, I mean, there's also an awful lot of like quite practical policy and sort of social implications from evolutionary psychology. A book that really, really changed my life and set me on the path towards writing my book was A Natural History of Rape by
Yeah.
Thornhill and Palmer.
Oh, sure.
which was enormously controversial at the time of its publication. I can't remember exactly when, but possibly 20 years ago or more.
It was, I think it came out in 2000, I believe.
Okay. And I wasn't aware of any of that controversy at the time, because I was 8 years old. But I learned about this book when I was working still at Rape Crisis, and I had a lot of misgivings about a lot of the standard feminist explanations for sexual violence. The most prominent of which is probably this idea that rape is not about sex, it's about power.
Right.
Yeah, the rapists aren't motivated by sexual desire. They're motivated by wanting to control their victims in some fashion, or even to control all women, that it's a sort of political act
Statement.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't think that seemed very likely to me. And and I was, because I was also seeing, I was doing several things, one of which was going to schools and teaching consent workshops. Another was working directly with victims and training volunteers for the helpline and so on. And so I just ended up speaking to a lot of victims. And one of the things that I was surprised by is how young they are. Like, rape victims are really young. Modal age is 15. And perpetrators are also younger than most people think. Perpetrators are only a little bit older than victims generally. And also things like about 2 to 5% of rape victims are male. And male rape victims are overwhelmingly raped in childhood, much, much more likely to be raped in childhood than in adulthood than are female. And that's the sort of thing where you think, how does the feminist theory explain that? Like, then I thought, well, hang on. If we recognize the fact that probably about 2 to 5% of men are gay or bisexual, suddenly that makes perfect sense.
Right.
The rapist would target the objects of their sexual interest. So I had all of these kind of queries in my head, and I came across A Natural History of Rape, and I went to the library and I read it, and it was just the scales falling from my eyes. It was just like, suddenly all of this makes sense. It all makes sense. And I mean, I'm not sufficiently trained in evolutionary biology and psychology to assess every claim made in the book, but the whole approach made perfect sense to me. And for those who don't know, the book was enormously controversial. The authors had to check under their cars, were advised by the police at one period to check under their cars for bombs. That was how much vitriol they attracted. But actually, you know, like one of the pieces of one of the prescriptive, there's a later chapter where they talk about sort of, you know, if we accept the idea that actually sexual aggression is evolved in men, for some reason there are different explanations as to why it might have evolved in men, and there's a range as well. Some men are more sexually aggressive than others, but there's probably some sort of bell curve. But if we accept this, what can we do about it? And one of the very sort of minor prescriptions that they have is to put the male and female accommodation at summer camp in different bits of the site. You know, just because if you leave adolescent or teenage girls and boys alone together, particularly if they have access to alcohol, like it's quite likely that sexual assault might be a consequence of that. And one of the things you can do in a very, very practical way is just not allow them to be together with, you know, particularly with alcohol. And to my mind, that's just such like a blindingly obvious, but also incredibly useful piece of advice for any parent, for any teacher. And that's exactly the sort of thing that you're not allowed to say. You're not allowed to say,
Right.
as I have learned in some courses from having written this book. Some people just don't want to hear it.
So a couple of things I want to say. Number one, regarding your last point about you know, separating the boys and girls in camp, the only context where that is unnecessary, it might at first surprise you, but once I explain it, I think you'll see it. There's something called the Westermark effect, whereby, you know, kids who are raised together from a young age developmentally, even if they are non-kin, will develop a sexual repulsion to each other in exactly the way you would expect it of siblings. So it's what's called an ontogenetic mechanism, meaning it's a developmental one. The Darwinian mechanism says if raised together, then be sexually repulsed. Well, in Israel, in the kibbutzim, in those communal living, kind of the Marxist utopia that you know, that some Israelis thought would happen, these communal farms, you didn't have to worry about doing what you suggested, because the boys and girls were raised together, even though they came from different, you know, they were not kin, and yet they weren't having sex with each other. So that I just thought that was a small parenthesis of. Go ahead.
Do you know what the crucial age is for when the kids
At
need
which,
to
so I definitely, so there is that's a great question. There is a type of, I actually discussed this in this book, my first book, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption. So I'm going to try to answer your question by giving you another cultural example. So there is a particular type of a marriage arrangement in the Far East, whereby a girl is betrothed to a little boy from a very young age, and then she goes and lives with the boy's family. And I think it's in the order of by age 4 or 5. It's definitely, if you do it before then, that repulsion is going to kick in. So certainly by that point, so it's not as though they have to be raised together from, you know, 2 weeks old, but that you're sufficiently conscious of the fact that you were raised together. So I can't remember the exact age, but it's in the order of 4 or 5.
Okay.
And
sending kids to school together wouldn't be sufficient.
That wouldn't be sufficient. Exactly right. Yeah, that's a great question. Now you might say, well, okay, well, how do you, in the case of the kibbutzim, we know that the mechanism is operating because they're not having nonstop sex with each other. If anything, they're like, ooh, this is disgusting. I can't even think about that. In the case of the marriage, I think the Far East arranged marriages, I think it's greater rate. So the dependent variables that to measure the hypothesis or to test the hypothesis, that the rate of failed marriages that stem from that arrangement are higher. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, the rate of sexual dysfunction within the marriage is higher, in exactly how you would predict it. But to your earlier point about checking underneath the cars for bombs, Randy Thornhill is a personal friend of mine. He actually came on the show last year, but many years ago in 2006, when I was finishing that first book that I just mentioned earlier, I had been kindly invited by the University of New Mexico, where he's still a professor, to speak to their evolutionary group. And so we had gone out, Randy and I, for lunch. And I asked him, I said, so give me some of the story. He said, oh, I had to have police, campus police protection all the time. And now to my final point, and then I'll cede the floor to you again. That perfectly demonstrates one of the cognitive and emotional obstacles for why people get so triggered from evolutionary psychology, because they presume that if you offer an evolutionary / scientific explanation for a phenomenon, that must imply that you are condoning it and justifying it. And the way I usually break people out of that, frankly, imbecility, is I say, well, this is like arguing, logically speaking, this is like arguing that an oncologist is for pancreatic cancer, because by trying to explain it, he or she is justifying it and is condoning it. But it's very, very hard for people if you try to explain child abuse or domestic violence or war or rape, then they think that you're giving cover for those ugly phenomena. Have you seen that in your own work?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, the naturalistic fallacy is alive and well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think people find I had this conversation actually with Diana Fleischman on my podcast a few weeks
Oh,
ago.
right.
Why do people find evolutionary psychology so alarming? And one of her points, which I think is definitely true, is it does ascribe extremely cynical motives to human beings, even though it's often not conscious cynicism. It's just quite grim.
Right.
And I think that if you want to sort of believe that we have anything angelic about us, then evolutionary psychology will quickly disabuse you of that notion, which just isn't very pleasant. So I think that, I mean, one of the responses I've had actually to the book, I mentioned that one of the criticisms was that I'm defeatist. Another criticism is that I paint all men as rapists, which I really don't. I say explicitly in the book several times that actually, the hashtag not all men, the response to the Me Too hashtag, is actually true. It's we don't know exactly the numbers because it's sort of infamously difficult to calculate, but it's definitely the case that a majority of men have never committed rape, and also that a majority of men would never commit rape. And actually, you can do studies in the lab where you sort of expose men to violent sexual imagery, and a majority of men are not aroused by it.
Right.
It's actually a good news story, right? The problem is that there is an unknown minority who are aroused by it and will either, be very, very strongly motivated to be sexually aggressive, or if presented with a particular set of circumstances where there's unlikely to be any consequences, might be sexually aggressive. And you don't, the difficulty for women, particularly for young women, because as I said earlier, victims of rape tend to skew really young, is they don't know who it is. So this is why women, are frightened of walking home alone at night, all of this, because it's a very fearsome risk, and it's very difficult to assess who poses a danger to you. So I'm really not saying that all men are rapists, but I am saying that there's probably some minority who are very risky. I mean, certainly until they age out of it. We know that men age out of all kinds of violent crime, including sexually violent crime, probably in their 40s. Normally, it's quite rare for someone to remain really aggressive.
It's called precipitous decline of testosterone.
Yeah, yeah. But during that period of peak testosterone, there probably are some men who just need to be in prison. Probably not very many, but some. And yeah, and again, it comes back to that utopianism thing. Like, if your goal is to have absolute harmony throughout the world, I have bad news for you. But
although if I can just not push back, but the idea that evolutionary psychology proposes all these grim realities about human nature, I think it certainly does that, but it also talks about all of the wonderful, laudable elements of human nature, right? I mean, heroism and romantic love and parental love and compassion and empathy, all of those things didn't arise out of magic. They also arose through an evolutionary mechanism. So I think wrongly or unfairly, evolutionary psychology gets a, you know, a slap on the wrist when it tries to explain the negative, you know, diabolical manifestations of the repertoire of possible human phenomena, but it is perfectly amenable to explaining all of the wonderful things that we do. So I would just call it a realist theory, because it captures the fact that humans are complicated. We can do amazingly wonderful and kind things, and we can be complete assholes, and that's all part of the repertoire of possibilities of the human condition, right?
Yeah. And also, I mean, I don't think that the sort of I don't really like using the word woke because it's quite imprecise, but let's say the woke view of human nature is not very sunny either.
Right.
Right? Like that view of the world is it's all about power, it's all about people dominating each other. Like certain groups not only have original sin but have absolutely no way of redeeming themselves. Like the
So white people
and men
and men,
and
white
straight
men.
people and so, yeah, you know, the baddies. Like there's it's sort of derived from Christianity, some of
Right.
these woke ideas, but it strips away any possibility of redemption, which is what
Right.
Christianity offers. So I wouldn't say that it's like a more attractive view of the world, at least to me, than the evolutionary psychology one. And also I think the evolutionary psychology one has the benefit of being true.
Right.
So
Do you now this I've never I mean, I I know that there's been a study that has looked at adoption of feminist ideology and certain I can't remember if it was morphological features, but anecdotally I've proposed that there must be some, you know, morphological predictors of the likelihood of women and to some this is going to be very offensive, but again, I deal with reality. I don't care about, you know, managing people's feelings. uh do you think there is any possible truth to that, the idea being that, so to the extent that some women who, let's say, are very beautiful, who will recognize that they have a lot of power in the mating market, just from a self interest perspective, they're less likely to adopt a lot of those, you know, the extreme militant ideology, you know, of the radical form of feminism, because it won't benefit them. Whereas, and forgive me, I don't mean to be mean, if you're Andrea Dworkin, maybe it makes sense to hold those values. Do you think there's any truth to this theory, or do you think it's just me being mean?
I think that status games and feminism is a really interesting area of study that I've been thinking about a lot. I think that people are drawn to certain status games within feminism for different reasons. One, I think there is definitely for women who have lower sexual market value, to use the more polite but also fairly cold
Yeah,
sort of
I was going to say
terminology of
the sterile terminology. Yes.
yeah. Certainly there are some ideas within feminism, the sort of big is beautiful, sort of opposition to what's often called like conventional ideas of beauty, which seems to offer access to men of higher sexual market value. If given that the goal seems to basically be with those sorts of campaigns, which predominate in women's magazines and on Instagram and so on, to basically persuade men to find different things sexy,
Right.
which I don't think is likely to work. I mean, it might work in the sense that men might profess open, you know, it might become socially unacceptable to prefer particular appearance in women. I don't think it's likely to actually affect how men sincerely feel. But you can see why it would be attractive if you feel low status,
Right.
basically.
Well, that's the genius of the Dove marketing campaign. That's
Yeah.
the genius of Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, right? Because it is espousing a message. You know, if I don't score well, I'm speaking now. If I were a woman, if I don't score well on some of the morphological metrics that I unfortunately can't change, whatever my facial symmetry, well, then I'm much more likely to accept the position that says, well, but don't worry about that because all of these things are completely random. They're socially constructed. That's the only place that men can keep you down, is by constructing this arbitrary so-called universal beauty standard. And then I don't know if it was millions, but many women decided to gulp up Naomi Wolf's book because it is a form of assuaging my deep Darwinian insecurities, correct?
Yes, although I'd say two things on that.
Sure.
One is, I think that there is, I think, a fair critique of sort of discourses on beauty. I don't think it's possible to just transform what we consider to be beautiful. I think what probably is a worthy goal is to encourage women to seek sources of self-esteem outside of beauty. Say, look, sorry, like kind of definitionally, beauty is hierarchical, and there's only a short period of your life where you have access to the top of the hierarchy, and many women will never have access to the top of the hierarchy. But you can have self-esteem as a mother, you can have self-esteem as a friend, as a member of your religious community. You know, there are all sorts of other ways in which you can feel that you are valued within your community, and that's a good thing. And to encourage women to only sort of load all of their status eggs into one basket, I think is a mistake. I mean, one of the reasons I called my podcast Maiden, Mother, Matriarch is I think that one of the features of our contemporary society, which is very harmful to women, is that women are encouraged to stay in the maiden mode as long as possible, and to never progress to the mother and the matriarch stages of life, which, yes, you know, you lose your beauty, you lose that sort of status, but you ought to attain other kinds of status. You know, there is status in being the matriarch, even if you're a withered old crone. There is, you know, there
Right.
ought to be status in that because you have wisdom, because you all of this, you have a position within the family. And I'd say as well that one of the means that women use now to try and stay in maiden mode forever is cosmetic surgeries and other interventions, which are hyper novel. Like, our ancestors didn't have access to these. And I think there is a strong argument for saying that actually, when you have a beauty industry that is constantly ratcheting up the sort of sophistication of that kind of technology and offering ever more expensive and sometimes dangerous forms of intervention, which
Sure.
I think the way that economy functions is that new tech comes onto the market. It's initially expensive and rare. It's adopted by celebrities who normalize it, etc. Things like Instagram. One of the reasons I'm sure that Instagram is so bad for teenage girls' mental health is it gives them the false impression. It gives them a false sense of the actual female intersexual competition that they're facing,
Exactly.
because they go onto Instagram and they see the most beautiful women in the world who have had various expensive procedures done and also are filtered and all of this, and they think that that's their peer group, when in fact, of course, their peer group is just as like chubby and spotty as they are,
Right.
because their peer
Well,
group is like normal. But I think that there is an argument actually for saying that maybe, you know, maybe we should ban the Brazilian butt lift, for instance, the world's most dangerous cosmetic procedure. Women, like dozens of women, die every year going and getting this procedure done. The Kardashians claim not to have it done, you know, but that,
yes.
like, maybe we should be putting a ceiling on the interventions available, because that would change the whole market. And maybe this constant ratcheting up is actually doing women a lot of harm. So,
Yeah, I was going to say, when you mentioned the intrasexual competition as you know, miscalibrated in young girls' heads when they watch Instagram, there is actually I believe actually a British-based psychiatrist. I think his name is Abed, Abed, if I'm not mistaken, who has looked at eating disorders from an evolutionary perspective, rooted in this miscalibration of intrasexual competition. Exactly to your point. I mean, he didn't use the example of Instagram because when those papers came out, there wasn't any Instagram. So I think there's definitely a lot of validity to what you're saying. I wanted to just briefly move to a few other issues to discuss. What are your thoughts of on and again, forgive me that I haven't seen it in your book yet. I haven't read it carefully, but pornography. You have a position on that?
broadly anti.
Because?
Because I mean, particularly anti online pornography, because I think it's a completely different product from Playboy magazine of the 1960s. And I think that it has a very, very deleterious effect on sexual cultures and on its consumers. Actually, I think that men have a very, you know, good reason to strongly object to online porn, because I think it manipulates the term I use in the book is limbic capitalism, which I borrowed from David Courtwright, meaning business models that depend on manipulating people's limbic systems, i.e., the bit of the brain responsible for feeling, and unconsciously, crucially. So things like gambling, junk food, opioids, smoking, and definitely online porn are all examples of limbic capitalism, which has become much, much more sophisticated as time has gone by. And businesses are really, really good at manipulating our limbic systems. You know, just things like the reason that so many apps on phones are brightly coloured, particularly blue, and look like they sort of shine at the edges is because we find things that
Yeah.
look like fresh water and fresh fruit very appealing for evolutionary reasons. I actually set my phone to grayscale. You know, you can do that in the settings to make it less addictive. And it really works. It's actually much, much less appealing when it's in grayscale. These are all the sort of subtle manipulations that businesses use. And a lot of us are very susceptible to them, and some of us more than others. Some people seem to be particularly vulnerable to the addictive effects of limbic capitalist products. And porn is definitely one of those. Porn users are very much on a Pareto distribution, and I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but it's something like 2% of users watch porn for more than 7 hours a week or something like that.
Wow.
And I might be getting those numbers slightly wrong, but basically there is a small minority who watch an enormous amount of porn and are basically incapable of having normal sexual relationships as a consequence of that,
Right.
because they end up with erectile dysfunction with real people, and also they are likely to end up with increasingly weird sexual tastes because of the way that the platforms are designed to suggest more and more sort of niche and extreme content
Right.
to people who are already susceptible.
Yeah, no, so I like the term limbic capitalism. I wish I knew it when I wrote some of my older books, because to your point, in several of my earlier books, I talk about the evolutionary roots of what I call dark side consumption. So these are forms of consummatory acts that are that ostensibly are maladaptive. So pornographic addiction, you mentioned pathological gambling, eating disorders, excessive suntanning, compulsive buying. And so what I argue is that if you look at the epidemiology of each of these dark side consumption phenomena, they happen in exactly the same forms, irrespective of time period, irrespective of culture, whereby the sex of the sufferer is pretty much the main demographic predictor. So eating disorders, compulsive buying, excessive suntanning are almost exclusively female-based afflictions. Pornographic addictions, pathological gambling, excessive physical and financial risk-taking are almost exclusively male. And then that insight then begs for you to ask the question of, so then what is the evolutionary reason for that maladaptive behavior? And what I argue in my books is that it's a misfiring of an otherwise adaptive process, right? So for example, when it comes to compulsive buying, I was able to predict, even before I had gotten into the literature on compulsive buying, what it is that women who suffered from that affliction would be compulsively hoarding. And it wasn't lawnmowers and electric guitars. It was beautification products, right? It was stilettos, it was cosmetics, it was sexy clothes. And so you take an adaptive mechanism, which is I'd like to beautify myself in the mating market, and you make it hyperactive. It's the same argument for OCD, right? OCD is the scanning for dangers. Well, when it is within a regulated zone, within an adaptive zone, it makes perfect sense for you to wash your hands if you just shook the hand of someone who was coughing incessantly there. But if you spend 8 hours before going to work washing your hands with scalding hot water, then that's probably OCD. And so are you familiar with that literature that tries to root? Okay. Do you want to add anything to that?
Um, one of the examples I use in the book is the Australian Jewel Beetle. Have you
I don't think so. Tell me about
read
that.
this? I can't remember the name of the researchers now, but there was this research done in Australia of the jewel beetle, which is very commonly found in arid parts of Australia, and it's this sort of big beetle like this, and they're golden coloured and sort of shiny. And researchers discovered, I think this was in the 80s, that people, my family are Australian,
Mm.
the classic beer bottle that you get in Australia is a sort of short brown shiny beer bottle. It's called a stubby. People had been throwing stubbies out of their cars, and they were sort of littering the sides of the roads. And the jewel beetles were so attracted to the glossy, shiny bottles that the males were actually choosing to mate with the bottles rather than with the females
Wow.
because it was a super stimulus,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? And this is, I think, what porn basically does as well, and what sex
Exactly.
robots do as well. They tap into what is an adaptive feature, but they do it in a maladaptive way, because of an environmental mismatch. And yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, you can make a very sort of just, even aside from all the feminist objections to the exploitation of porn performers and effects on sexual culture and all of this, you can just make straightforwardly a sort of pro-man case
Right.
against the porn industry and say that actually users are being exploited, which they are. And you end up with this weird effect as well in the sexual culture, where on the one hand, you have an increasingly hyper-sexualized public life. You have much more explicit sex scenes on television. You'll have lingerie models on the streetscape, etc., in ways that you never used to even a few decades ago. But you also actually have people having less sex, the so-called sex recession, where young people in particular are having less sex, and it's increasingly common for men to enter their 20s or even 30s still being virgins and so on. I actually think that those things are connected to one another. I think there's an extent to which, when people have constant access to sexual stimuli, particularly in porn, the super stimuli of porn, they're less motivated to have real sexual relationships with one another. And the risk and the difficulty involved in going out and finding a real partner and putting up with all their nonsense and all the nature of real human relationships, you can bypass that and you can just find all of your sexual release in porn or in your sex robot. I think this is increasingly where we're headed, that there will be an even more extreme super stimulus available. And I think it's really sad, and I do not welcome the future where you have young men who in another life could have been happy, productive husbands and fathers, instead choosing to opt out.
Right. Do you get of course this is not me saying it. I'm putting my detractor hat, my Louise Perry detractor hat. Do you get any, I'm sure you do, you're so puritanical, Louise, that you're right. It's just, I mean, why don't you chill out a bit and appreciate the fact that there is great release in freedom, live and let live, and stop being so conservatively preachy.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that might be the number one attack that is levied at you, no?
Um, I don't know. I get it from all sides, which I think it's probably a good sign. Hopefully it means that I'm like forging an original path of some kind. Um, yes. I mean, to which I say, do you have any idea what the Puritans were really like? I
Right.
am weak sauce compared to, not just compared to actual, Puritans of the 17th century, but compared to actually all societies ever.
Yeah.
I think that one of the features of um our current historical moment is that people don't realize how strange it is, and that there are enormous numbers of ways in which the way that we live is radically different from the way that our ancestors lived, and that people live in other parts of the world still. And one of them is when it comes to um, sexual norms. Like, no culture ever decides that a free-for-all is the correct way of dealing with the regulation of heterosexuality, right? Like, the nature of heterosexuality is that there is we started at the top of the show talking about this. Men and women are profoundly different. There are certain risks that women carry in relation to things like pregnancy and violence that men don't carry. There are asymmetries inherent to sexual politics, which are just a feature of life. And to some extent, you can do away with them with the pill, or at least you can ameliorate them to some extent. I mean, you can't actually sort of change our brains. One of the arguments I make in the book is that even if we now have novel technologies which allow you to suspend your fertility, your brain doesn't know that, right? So when you're having a casual sexual relationship with someone, your brain doesn't know that you're not risking pregnancy. So particularly
to that point, I mean, and that's kind of part of the whole mismatch hypothesis. To that point, even though we now have DNA paternity tests, men's emotional, cognitive, and behavioral strategies to thwart paternity uncertainty hasn't magically disappeared, because we no longer face that because we've got DNA paternity tests. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, we still have Stone Age brains, and you can't just, we've had the pill for 60 years. There's nothing in terms of our species history. Yes, we've had the pill for 5 minutes in historical terms. We've had the idea of sexual liberations. This is hyper novel stuff. The vast majority of cultures have things like marriage, have things like a taboo on premarital sex, generally for women, have all sorts of ways which are now considered to be very authoritarian of regulating heterosexuality. I don't necessarily propose, a complete return to that kind of system, because I think we do now have the pill. We do have a radically different economy. There are all sorts of ways in which our material circumstances are now completely different. At the same time, I think it's very hubristic to think that you can just sort of redesign society on the back of an envelope and just do away with the whole idea of any kind of, the basic principle of liberal feminism is that with consent, anything goes. The only thing that matters is consent. Right. Everything else can be removed. And actually, there's a deliberate opposition to anything viewed as traditional. And I think that system is doomed to failure. It's failing already. That's what Me Too was all about.
Yeah.
The fact that actually completely obliterating or attempting to traditional sexual norms actually puts women at risk of sexual assault.
Yeah. All right. No, that sounds good. That sounds good, but yes, I'm with you. 3 more quick, sort of more personal questions. Number 1, much of your work is, female related, improving the lot of women in all sorts of important ways. Do you ever foresee, I mean, is there a higher supra goal? I want to make the world better, and I will start off by dealing with half of humanity called women and improving their lot, but then I'll move on to other things? Or do you foresee that, for the rest of your life, and of course there's enough work to last a lifetime, do you always foresee staying within that lane?
I mean, I think when you write about, as far as I can tell, I actually have as many male readers as female. And you can't write about heterosexuality without writing about men. To some extent, I am able to write about some of these topics in a more provocative way because I can get away with it because I'm a woman. I'm aware of that, which is why, I can have more of an impact on those topics and be strategic about that, which is worth doing. I mean, my next book that I'm working on at the moment is called The Case for Having Kids.
Oh, actually, that was going to be one of my other questions.
Oh, wow.
Other projects. So you're go ahead, segue into that. Go ahead.
Which obviously is very relevant to women. So, I mean, to put it very briefly, The Case for Having Kids is not that kids are delightful, though they are. And I'm the mother of a nearly 2-year-old, and I do think that kids are wonderful, and I want to have a whole bunch more.
Yeah. Wait till that kid is 14, and then we'll have a conversation again.
But rather that actually we have precipitously declining birth rates almost everywhere in the world, and particularly in the West, and there are all sorts of very troubling social consequences from that and economic consequences from that, which I don't think people have recognized sufficiently. And it's very likely that the welfare state is going to collapse in my lifetime because of the nature of demographic imbalance. And I mean, putting it bluntly, basically, if you don't have kids, you're not going to have a welfare state there to look after you when you're old. So the case for having kids is actually a very kind of urgent economic one, as well as being an emotional one. But a lot of the book is about why it is that so many women in particular have just chosen to forgo motherhood. This is very much a trend driven by women and access to contraception and education. All of the things that correlate with declining birth rates are basically to do with women opting out of motherhood. And I think we haven't made. I'm trying to offer a sort of feminist case for motherhood.
Right. I'm wondering, in cases where, I don't know if you've addressed this in your next book, but in cases where a couple has decided to remain childless, is there any data that shows how much of that decision is based on the woman making that decision versus the man?
Interesting question. I don't know.
That would be a good study.
Yeah, I do know that female education correlates with
Not having kids. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but male education doesn't.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Well, if anything,
Yeah.
it might actually increase it, because with more education, my status goes up as a man, and status is the biggest correlate to me having sexual access to many women. And so I might expect it to actually be the opposite. It increases my reproductive success. Okay, last question. I mean, originally I would have asked you, what's your next project? But you already addressed that. So it's a bit off in terms of the cadence. It's become customary for me to ask the following question about regret, if only because in one of the ending chapters of my forthcoming book on happiness, I talk about the fact that, if you could live a life that hopefully is free of many looming regrets, then you achieve what the ancient Greeks talked about, ataraxia, tranquility of mind. And of course, by the way, regret, there's an evolutionary element to it. When you talk about sexual regret, what is it that men regret? They regret the foregone opportunities that they didn't take, whereas women regret the ones that they actually did take, the short-term mate with some idiot who...
It's a very telling difference.
Yeah, exactly. But not necessarily rooting it in a sexual dynamic. Regret is a very interesting phenomenon for me. I mean, because I was originally exposed to it by one of my former professors in my PhD, Thomas Gilovich, who's one of the pioneers of this study of the psychology of regret, where he distinguishes between regret due to action. I regret that I cheated on my wife and that put an end to my marriage, versus regret due to inaction. I decided to become a physician because I come from a family of physicians, but I really wanted to be an artist, and I regret that I never became an artist. And it turns out that over the long term, Louise, most people's most looming regret is one of inaction. So having set that ground for you, and you're still a very young woman, if you look back at your life so far, what would be your biggest regret, if you don't mind sharing?
I slightly regret not having a baby younger.
Okay.
Although I did, because then I would have more time to have more children with more spacing. I mean, I wasn't that old. I got pregnant with my first child at 28, which actually in my social circle is extraordinarily young. But I mean, it's
borderline pedophilia in today's world.
It's difficult because if I had a first, because I've been with my husband for 10 years now, and if we sort of, if contraception hadn't existed, we'd probably have 3 children by now. But also, would I have been able to, I mean, actually, to be fair, I did write this book while pregnant and with a baby, but would I have been able to do all the various things that I've done professionally? Maybe not.
Right.
Because there is a trade-off. It's true that you can't have it all. So.
Yeah. I actually I empathize with that regret, because my wife and I have been together for 23 years, and our children are much younger than you would have otherwise expected. We took the willful decision of having them late, and I would have preferred for them to be number 3 and 4 rather than number 1 and 2. So I completely share. Probably, if we're talking about parental regrets, my other, I mean, it's not a existential regret, but a looming regret is that my wife and I speak many languages collectively. I also speak fluent French. Arabic is my mother tongue, and also Hebrew. We're Lebanese Jews. My wife speaks Armenian. So between the two of us, we speak 5 languages, and yet our children are, only fluent in French and English. I greatly regret that, because I think it truly opens up the world to you if you're able to just break out into completely different languages. And so I regret that I didn't have the the discipline to teach them all those different languages. Thoughts?
I am a terrible linguist.
Only
I
one,
really
English.
I speak a little bit of French because I was forced to do it at school, but
Okay.
otherwise it's a source of debate with my husband because my husband's a fantastic linguist and he speaks Japanese and he's
Oh
learning
wow.
Arabic and yeah, he's
But
Latin,
he's
Greek.
what? He's British. He's
He's
not.
British.
Oh wow. So
Yeah.
how did he learn Arabic and Japanese? What's the story there? Not. I mean, I know we're
He
coming to the
just
end of. Go ahead.
he decided to take Japanese at school just because he was interested in it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So he
That's
did it. He did it like independently outside of school, um, and uh, and then has and then he has got an Arabic tutor as an adult, and yeah, he's just really, really good at languages, really interested in them, and he thinks that he finds me bewildering because I'm just like, well, I just it would be an enormous amount of boring work. I don't I don't want to, and
right.
also being good at English is like my only skill. If you take that away from me, what have I got? If I
Yes.
try and do, I can't work in French.
A specialist versus a jack of all trade. I get it.
Yeah.
All right. I want to promote your book again. Guys, go out, get this. Look, it's even small enough you could take it to the beach. So please go out and purchase it. Louise, any last words? It was truly delightful to speak to you. Anything else you want to add that we might have forgotten to cover?
No, I didn't think so. There's an audiobook of the book as well.
Okay. Is it
Yeah.
with your, if I may say, I hope your husband doesn't beat me up. Is it with your intoxicating and alluring voice?
I insisted on reading it, yes.
Oh, well, you did a much better job than I did because the biggest criticism I received on the parasitic mind is that I wasn't the narrator. And I explained to the people who were very upset that it wasn't my voice, that it wasn't ultimately my decision to make. The audio publisher who buys it ultimately has the final say, and for whatever reason, they decided not to go with the voice of the Lebanese Barry White. And
Yeah.
so, but in your case, apparently, is it
They
really
didn't no, they didn't want to use me because it was an American audiobook publisher, and the convention apparently in America is generally to use a voice actor. So they pushed really hard actually to use a voice
and
actor
what was it that what's the marketing persuasion tactic that you used that allowed you to break through their position?
to refuse to sign the contract.
Really? You were that
Yeah.
committed to you reading the why? What's
Partly because the voice actor, well, this is a bit indiscreet, but partly because the voice actor they found I thought was very bad. And I just really didn't like the idea of having a substandard narrator, and partly because I'm just constantly get emails from people saying I apparently have an ASMR voice. I didn't know this before
you
I
truly
started.
do. I don't
Yeah,
know exactly what the metrics of that concept is, the AS whatever, but I mean I certainly do notice it that you have a kind of a beguiling. I mean the British also adds, right, because two people can say the exact same thing. One person says it in Southern drawl, the other one says them in British English, and then suddenly the British one is a lot smarter, right? So
you add
there's
like
that
20 IQ points. Yeah.
exactly. So
Yes. I think that the asthma voice is a bit like coriander. I don't think it works on everyone.
right, okay, very interesting.
It's quite an interesting science, which is entirely new to me, but yeah.
Well, good job. If it doesn't, if that whole writing career doesn't work out for you, you've got a whole new audio career that can open up in the future.
You're not the first to say that.
Well, thank you so much. It's a delight. Stay on the line so we can say goodbye offline. Real pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.